I walked into the dark basement of the house I grew up in and found my mother sitting on a rusty folding chair near the furnace, her trembling fingers tracing the mother-of-pearl buttons on the navy dress she had saved for her 65th birthday party. Meadow, my brother's wife, had moved all of my mother's belongings down here just to turn her master bedroom into a creative office for herself. My brother, Elliot, stood at the kitchen door upstairs, swirling a glass of expensive wine bought with my mother's retirement money, and calmly claimed she had volunteered for this private space. They had turned the true owner of this home into a forgotten boarder in the dark, while Meadow secretly planned a luxury cruise using a Medicare account my mother had never even touched. I stood there in my MP uniform, still covered in road dust, and I knew I did not just come home to eat birthday cake. I came home to take back the seat at the head of the table for the woman who gave me life. Hello everyone, I am Leona. I just drove over 700 miles to return to this familiar red brick house in the suburbs, where the smell of my mother's cornbread used to greet me at the front door. But today, the silence is terrifying. Before I go on, I truly want to know how you are doing today, and please take a second to hit the like button and say hello in the comments. I need your presence, because the story I am about to tell you about my mother, Loretta, is not just about my family. It is a story about the cost of silence that many of us may be carrying in secret. I stepped through the threshold of the red brick house, expecting the sweet, heavy scent of my mother's cornbread to pull me in like it always had. But as the door clicked shut behind me, that familiar warmth was nowhere to be found. Instead, the air felt thin and dry, smelling of that sharp, industrial air freshener that tries too hard to hide the fact that a home has stopped breathing. I walked straight into the kitchen, the room that had always been the command center of our lives, the place where every family crisis was resolved over a pot of stew. On the counter, I saw the blue Maxwell House coffee tin sitting in its usual spot. Mother had used that same tin for over 30 years, refilling it every Tuesday morning like clockwork. I reached for it, expecting the familiar weight of the grounds, but it felt light as a feather in my hand. When I opened the lid, there was nothing but a fine layer of gray dust at the bottom. It had been empty for a long time, forgotten on a shelf that used to be the heart of her morning ritual. Tucked under a thick stack of AARP magazines, I found 3 unopened letters from the VA. My mother had been the backbone of her logistics unit, a woman who never missed a detail or a deadline in her life. But here were notices for 3 missed appointments for her arthritis, letters that had been pushed aside as if they no longer mattered. The living room was shrouded in a gray, hazy light because the heavy curtains were pulled shut, creating an atmosphere of endless, silent waiting in the dark. The quiet was suddenly shattered by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels against the hardwood floor. It was a sound that did not belong here, especially not on the surface my mother used to spend every Saturday morning polishing until she could see her own reflection in the wood. Meadow walked in with a dozen bright red bags from Target hanging from her arms, her face twisted into a sweet, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. She did not even look at the empty coffee tin or the dust on the counter. She just sighed softly and said, "Mother decided she did not want to go to the doctor anymore, and she just needs more rest." I looked past her toward the far corner of the porch. Mother was standing there, staring at a row of withered rose bushes she used to take so much pride in. Her shoulders were hunched, pulled inward as if she were trying to melt into the red brick wall behind her. She did not say a word to defend herself or tell me that she was in pain. She did not even look up to meet my gaze. She just reached down and quietly smoothed the front of her navy dress with her palms, the repetitive habit of a woman who had learned that her voice no longer had a place in her own home. I watched my mother's eyes drift toward a large blank space on the living room wall, right above the fireplace where my father's portrait in his full dress uniform used to hang. For 30 years, that spot had been the sanctuary of our family pride, a constant reminder of the man who had served his country and protected this home. Now, there was nothing but a pale rectangle of unfaded wallpaper surrounded by gray dust. Meadow had taken it down. She had replaced the history of our lives with soulless abstract prints, calling it a mid-century style upgrade that the house desperately needed. I eventually found our old life shoved into a plastic bin in the dark corner of the garage, buried under a pile of broken garden tools and discarded holiday decorations. Digging through the shadows, I pulled out the family album from Christmas 1994. In that photo, my mother was radiant, standing tall beside my father with her hands resting firmly on his shoulders. She was the one who ran everything then, from the perfectly set table to the laughter that filled every single room in this house. Seeing those memories treated like unwanted trash made a cold shiver run down my spine. I stood there in the dusty garage for a long time, my fingers tracing the yellowed edges of the plastic pages. The guilt felt like a physical weight in my chest, a crushing realization that I had been away at my post for far too long while this quiet erasure was happening. Most of us who spend our lives building a home, pouring every ounce of our love into the walls and the memories they hold, never expect the day when our own children will look at those treasures as nothing more than clutter to be cleared away. We do not think our legacy will become an inconvenience for the people we raised. I wondered exactly when my mother started believing that she had to let someone else define who she was. I wondered when she stopped fighting for the woman she used to be in that 1994 photograph, and when she decided that her own history was something she had to apologize for. I took my father's portrait out of the box and carried it back into the living room, clearing a space on the shelf to set it down. I wanted her to see him again, to remember that she belonged in the light. But before I could even adjust the frame, Elliot walked in, his eyes glued to his phone screen as he told me to stop making things more complicated. He stood there with a casual indifference that hurt more than a shout would have. He told me that Meadow was right, that keeping all this old stuff around was only making our mother more gloomy, and that we needed to look forward. I looked at my brother, the man I had looked up to my entire life, and I realized he had become a stranger. He was willing to help erase our own mother's identity, just to stay in the good graces of a woman he had barely known for 2 years. He was treating our father's memory like a burden, and our mother's life like a story that had already ended. The morning of my mother's 65th birthday arrived with a silence that felt like a physical blow. There was no festive music, no smell of a baking cake, and not a single phone call from my brother Elliot. I stood in the empty hallway of the house my parents had paid off decades ago, listening to the hollow echo of my own breath. I went looking for her, and when I finally opened the door to the basement, my heart stopped. She had been moved down there, into the damp and the dark, sitting on an old, rusty folding chair right next to the furnace. Upstairs, Meadow had filled my mother's sunlit master bedroom with monitors and filing cabinets for her new creative office, while the woman who built this life was tucked away like unwanted storage. What broke me was seeing my mother still wearing that navy dress, her very best one with the pearl buttons, sitting there in the dim light and quietly waiting for a celebration that was never going to happen. I could see her trying to make herself small, tucking her feet under the chair as if she were trying to apologize for taking up even a single inch of space in her own home. While she sat in the shadows, I went back upstairs and found the mail she had been hiding. I opened the joint bank statement and my hands began to shake as I read through the columns of numbers. There were withdrawals every few days at high-end fashion boutiques Mother had never even heard of. Meadow had drained the retirement account, taking every cent my father had worked 30 years to save, leaving my mother without enough money to even buy a fresh tin of Maxwell House coffee. The account was empty. Every cent. Gone. I stood there in the middle of the kitchen surrounded by those bills, feeling the sharp, heavy anger of an MP officer rising in my chest. To see a person who had spent her entire life as a protector now being stripped of her security down to the last penny was a betrayal I could not ignore. I found Meadow in the living room, scrolling through her phone and showing off photos of a luxury cruise she called her recovery vacation. She just smiled at me and said that Mother did not know how to manage money anymore, so she had to take over for everyone's sake. Seeing her treat my mother's Medicare card like her own personal credit card told me that every second I stayed silent, I was becoming an accomplice to a crime. If you've ever saved your whole life for your children's future, only to wake up feeling like a stranger to your own bank account, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Like this video if this resonates with you. Standing in that dark basement after discovering the empty bank account felt like being trapped in a foxhole with no radio and no way out. But then, the phone in my pocket vibrated. It was a call from a contact at the Veterans Affairs office, an old friend of my father's who had heard I was back in town. That single vibration was the first crack of light in a very long night. A reminder that even when you feel completely isolated, the community you once served is still standing guard. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor of that basement, not because I had to, but because I wanted to be near my mother while I made a plan. I watched her sleep on that narrow cot, her breathing shallow and uneven, and I promised her that the next sun she saw would be a different kind of light. The next morning, I drove her to the VA clinic. The air inside the building was a mixture of industrial floor wax and that specific burnt smell of hospital coffee, a scent that usually made my skin crawl from my days in the service. But today, it felt like a sanctuary. We were met by Dr. Thompson, a man who had spent 30 years in a flight suit before picking up a stethoscope. He didn't look at my mother as a patient or a case number. He didn't even look at her chart first. He just poured her a cup of hot coffee in a thick, chipped ceramic mug and sat down across from her. He asked her about the years my father spent in the logistics unit, listening with a quiet, steady respect that had been completely absent from our red brick house for years. I saw my mother glance toward the clinic door every few seconds, her shoulders pulled tight as if she expected Meadow to burst through and tell her she was being dramatic. But the doctor just kept listening. He spoke with a gravelly kindness that made the room feel smaller and safer, and slowly, the rigid tension in my mother's neck began to soften. He led us into an exam room that was flooded with the kind of brilliant, warm afternoon sun that seems to make everything look a little more honest. It was such a sharp, painful contrast to the damp, gray shadows of the basement we had left behind. Dr. Thompson moved with a slow, deliberate pace, carefully documenting every swollen joint and every sharp wince of pain my mother had been silently enduring for the last 6 months. He didn't rush her. He touched her hands with a level of care that made my throat tighten. He looked her right in the eye and told her that she deserved the best medical care this country could provide, not just because she was a veteran's widow, but because she was a human being with inherent value. My mother didn't say a word at first. She just reached into the pocket of her navy dress, pulled out an old lace-edged handkerchief, and began to cry. They weren't the loud, sobbing tears of someone who wants attention. They were the quiet, heavy tears of a woman who had finally been seen after months of being treated like a ghost. While she composed herself, Dr. Thompson brought out an iPad. He sat next to her and showed her how to use it, his large, weathered hands incredibly patient as he guided her trembling fingers across the smooth glass. He explained that there was a support group for widows, a community of women who met over FaceTime to share their stories and their strength. I watched her touch the screen, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp curiosity as she saw the faces of other women who looked just like her. A world that Meadow had intentionally cut off, a world of friendship and shared experience, was suddenly reappearing through a simple piece of technology. For the first time in 2 years, my mother realized she was not an island. She began to see that the silent wounds she had been carrying were shared by others, and that there was a bridge leading out of her isolation. I stood out in the hallway for a moment, watching her through the small crack in the door. My chest ached with a mixture of intense gratitude and a burning sense of shame that nearly brought me to my knees. It had taken a stranger, a man who didn't even know her favorite color, to do what my own brother had refused to do. He saw her. He didn't see a medical record or an inconvenience to be managed. He saw a person worth fighting for. I realized then that my duty as an MP wasn't just about uncovering Meadows' financial theft or my brother's cowardice. It was about restoring the belief in my mother that she still mattered to the world. I was a woman trained to find the truth in the middle of chaos, but standing in that sterile, sunlit hallway, I felt like I was finally learning what true protection looked like. It wasn't about fences or locks. It was about dignity. We walked out to the parking lot as the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the North Carolina sky in shades of deep orange and bruised purple. My mother reached out and took my hand, her grip surprisingly firm and warm. For the first time since I arrived, she didn't look down at the pavement or stare at the withered rose bushes with a sense of defeat. She kept her chin up, her eyes clear and focused on the car. We had a treatment plan, a schedule for her physical therapy, and a new sense of purpose that hadn't been there when we pulled into the lot. I knew the road ahead was still going to be difficult, and the fight for our home was far from over. But the light from that afternoon at the VA had lit a fire in me that wouldn't be easily put out. The darkness was no longer the only thing in the room. Sunday morning arrived with the distant, steady tolling of the bells from First Baptist Church. It was a sound that had been the heartbeat of my mother's life for over 40 years, a rhythmic reminder of where she belonged and who she was. But as the chime drifted through the open window, I found my mother standing perfectly still in front of her bedroom mirror, her hands hovering uncertainly over the lapels of her Sunday best blue coat. It was an old coat, maybe 15 years old, but she had kept it pristine, brushed free of every stray lint, and folded with a level of care only a woman of her generation truly understands. Her fingers were trembling as she touched the fabric. Meadow had spent months whispering to the neighbors, planting cruel seeds of doubt about my mother's mind, claiming she was confused or becoming too frail to handle the world outside that red brick house. I could see the fear in my mother's eyes, the quiet, suffocating dread that her old friends would look at her with pity instead of respect. She turned to me, her gaze searching mine, silently asking if she still had a right to sit in her usual pew, or if she had truly become the broken thing Meadow told everyone she was. We made it as far as the hallway before Elliot stepped into our path, his arms crossed over his chest. He did not raise his voice, but his words were sharp and cold as he told me that Mother was under too much stress and that she should stay home to rest so we would not make a scene in front of the congregation. He was trying to protect the lie he and Meadow had built, trying to keep her hidden away like a shameful secret. I did not argue with him. I did not waste my breath on words he was never going to hear. I simply reached out and gently tucked my mother's arm into mine, feeling the slight shudder in her frame as she leaned into me. I guided her forward, walking right past him as if he were nothing more than a ghost in his own hallway. We stepped out onto the gravel path leading to the church entrance, and I could feel the strength returning to her step with every crunch of stone beneath her feet. It was not just a walk to a Sunday service. It was the first time in years she was walking back into her own life. When we finally pulled open the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary, the air was filled with the familiar scent of old wood and hymnals. Before we could even find our seats, the women from her old baking committee were on their feet. They did not look at her with pity, and they did not treat her like she was fragile. They swarmed around her, pulling her into tight, genuine hugs that smelled of lavender and peppermint. Not one person mentioned the rumors Meadow had been spreading or asked if she was feeling confused. Instead, Mrs. Gable grabbed her hand and told her how much they had missed her ginger snap recipe at the last bake sale. They treated her like the pillar of the community she had always been. For the first time in 2 long, dark years, I saw a real smile break across my mother's tired face, a light that reached her eyes and stayed there, proving that the lies had no power in a room full of people who truly knew her heart. The red brick house did not feel like a prison anymore. It started with the smell of cinnamon and old, familiar paper. Mrs. Gable, our neighbor from 3 doors down, walked right past Meadow at the front door one afternoon, carrying a worn, wooden box. It was my mother's handwritten recipe collection, a treasure chest of every holiday meal and Sunday dinner we had ever shared. For years, Meadow had treated my mother like she was a guest who had overstayed her welcome, someone to be handled and managed. But as they sat at that kitchen table, with the recipe cards spread out like a map of a life well lived, the power shifted. I watched my mother lean in, her voice steady and clear as she explained to Mrs. Gable exactly how to season the pot roast so the carrots would not get too mushy. She was not the woman hiding in the basement anymore. She was the expert, the one with the knowledge everyone else needed. There is a specific kind of light that returns to a woman's eyes when she realizes she is still needed, that her decades of experience are not just clutter, but the very foundation of the community around her. I realized then that my mother's strength was not just coming back. It had been there all along, just waiting for the dust to be cleared away. While the laughter in the kitchen grew louder, I retreated to the small desk in the corner of the living room. My training as a military police officer is a part of me that I can never truly turn off. I look at documents the way a mechanic looks at an engine, searching for the one bolt that does not fit the design. I started digging into the insurance paperwork Meadow had been so careful to keep under lock and key. What I found made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She had not just been draining my mother's savings, she had been using my own service records to file fraudulent claims under my mother's name. She was using my identity, my career in the Army, to siphon off benefits that my mother had never seen. I felt a cold, sharp clarity in that moment. I thought I had caught a simple thief, but my intuition as an officer told me this was just a smokescreen. There was something darker underneath this, a level of calculation that went far beyond just stealing a few $1,000s from a retirement fund. It felt like uncovering a hidden trail in the middle of a thick forest. Later that evening, the kitchen felt warm and grounded in a way I had not seen since my father was alive. Tommy, my 8-year-old nephew, sat at the table with us. For months, Meadow had kept him away from my mother, telling him that Grandma Loretta was sick and might accidentally hurt him. But tonight, they were hunched over a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I watched the way Tommy looked at his grandmother when she reached out and clicked the final piece of the sky into place. It was a look of pure, unadulterated admiration. He was not seeing a frail, confused old woman. He was seeing the woman who knew how to solve the puzzle when no one else could. Meadow stood in the dark shadows of the hallway, her face tight with a quiet, simmering anger that she could not quite hide anymore. She watched us, her eyes darting between the 3 of us as we laughed and shared stories. But she did not dare step into the light of that kitchen. She knew that the wall of silence she had built was finally starting to crumble. Before I went to bed that night, my mother pulled me into the small pantry. Her movements were quick and precise, the way they used to be when she was managing the logistics for her unit. She reached under the floral paper lining of the bottom drawer and pulled out a stack of neatly folded receipts. She had not just been sitting in that basement waiting for time to pass. She had been documenting everything. Every time Meadow used her card for a boutique purchase, every time a withdrawal was made that she had not authorized, my mother had saved the proof. She pressed the papers into my hand, her grip like iron. She looked me in the eyes and whispered that she was not crazy and she was not confused. She told me she had just been waiting for me to come home so she would have someone she could trust with the truth. She had been playing a long, quiet game of survival, holding on to her dignity with both hands while the people she loved most tried to strip it away from her. I sat on the edge of the guest bed that night, looking at those receipts, and I felt a surge of energy that I have not felt since I was a young cadet. We often think of family as the people who share our blood, the ones who are supposed to be our safe harbor. But the truth is, sometimes family are the ones who are willing to betray you for a cruise or a new wardrobe. True family are the ones who show up when the shadows are the longest. Most women over 65 know this better than anyone else. They know that your value is not measured by your bank account or the title on your bedroom door. It is measured by the strength of your voice and the people who are willing to stand beside you when you finally decide to use it. I looked at the photo of my father on the nightstand and I knew he would be proud. We were not just uncovering a series of lies, we were reclaiming a life that had been almost erased. The next few days were spent in a coordinated, quiet effort to build a network of protection around my mother. I reached back out to Dr. Thompson at the VA and Mrs. Gable. They were not just neighbors and doctors anymore, they were witnesses. They had seen the clarity in her eyes and the way she had been treated. We started preparing a response that Meadow would never see coming. We were not going to shout or make a scene. We were going to use the truth as our foundation. That night, for the first time in over 2 years, my mother went to sleep without needing a single pill to calm her nerves. She slept deeply and peacefully because she knew she was not alone anymore. She knew she had a small, dedicated group of people standing between her and the people who wanted to make her invisible. We were building something out of honesty, and for the first time since I drove across those 700 miles, I felt like we had already won the most important part of the struggle. The fragile peace we had built over the last few days felt like a warm blanket on a cold North Carolina night. The house had begun to smell of lavender and slow simmering beef again, the way it did when I was a little girl. But that peace was shattered on Sunday evening. Sunday dinner was always the one ritual Meadow and Elliot couldn't quite bring themselves to cancel, though they usually spent the meal staring at their phones in a heavy, pointed silence. This time, however, Elliot didn't even wait for the pot roast to be served before he placed a thick manila folder on the lace tablecloth. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a practiced, hollow expression that I had seen on 100 people trying to hide a lie under a layer of false concern. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into that low, soothing tone he used when he wanted to convince my mother that he was the only one who truly had her best interests at heart. He started talking about Tommy. He talked about how the local schools weren't what they used to be, and how Tommy deserved a chance at a private academy that could guarantee his future. Then, the trap was set. He told my mother that Tommy's entire future, every opportunity that little boy would ever have, depended on her signing a few papers to take out a new mortgage on the red brick house. Meadow chimed in right on cue, her voice dripping with a sweetness that tasted like poison. She told my mother that it was a bit selfish to keep clinging to a big old house that was falling apart when she could use the equity to give her grandson a head start in life. My mother sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on her thin gold wedding ring, the one my father had placed on her finger 40 years ago. I could see the guilt beginning to gnaw at her, a familiar tactic they had used against her for years. She looked like she was shrinking right there in her chair, a woman who had spent her whole life giving until she had nothing left, now being told that her last bit of security was a burden to the people she loved. I reached across the table and picked up the folder before my mother could touch it. As I flipped through the pages, my training as an MP officer made the red flags jump out at me. The appraisal for the house was dangerously low, a deliberate undervaluation designed to pull as much cash out as quickly as possible. It wasn't about Tommy's education, It was a fire sale of my father's legacy to pay off the boutique credit cards and the luxury cruise Meadow had been bragging about. I looked at Elliot, who was carefully avoiding my gaze, focusing instead on his wine glass. He started rambling about how tired he was, how exhausting it was to manage the house and the bills, and how this was the only logical way to simplify things for everyone. He wanted her to believe that her independence was the reason he was stressed, that her very existence in her own home was a weight he could no longer carry. My mother's hand reached for the pen Elliot had placed next to the documents. She looked at me with eyes that were full of a desperate, heartbreaking plea for permission to just give in. She whispered that she just didn't want us to argue anymore, and that she wanted to keep the peace in the family. She was ready to sign away her safety just to stop the tension at the dinner table. Most women over 65 have been taught that their role is to be the shock absorber for everyone else's friction, but they don't realize that in those moments they are often signing their own name to an invisible sentence of isolation. I felt a wave of nausea as I realized my own brother was willing to leave our mother homeless in her 60s, just so he wouldn't have to tell his wife, no. I looked at Meadow and saw the raw greed simmering just beneath her carefully applied makeup. A predator doesn't always come with a snarl. Sometimes they come with a sigh and a complaint about how hard they are working for you. They make you believe that your needs are an attack on their well-being. It was a profound kind of disgust that settled in my stomach as I watched them try to auction off the memories of this house. They weren't seeing the walls that held our childhood or the porch where my father had sat every evening. They were just seeing a pile of cash that they felt entitled to. They were treating my mother like a bank that had finally run out of money, and they were ready to close the branch for good. I put my hand firmly over my mother's, stopping the pen before it touched the paper. I looked Elliot directly in the eye and told him that I had already spoken to my contacts at the VA about a full audit of the guardianship and her financial records. The change in the room was instantaneous. Meadow's fake smile vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp mask of fury. She started shouting about how I was destroying the family and how I was a bitter outsider who didn't understand what it took to care for an elderly parent. But my mother didn't flinch. She looked at Meadow, then at the pen, and then back at me. Slowly, with a quiet dignity I hadn't seen in years, she laid the pen down on the table and pushed the folder back toward her son. The boundary had been drawn in the middle of a Sunday dinner, and for the first time, the people who had spent years manipulating her silence found themselves staring into a void they couldn't control. If you've ever stayed quiet just to keep the peace, even when it cost you your dignity, tell me about the moment you finally spoke up. Drop a like if you believe a woman's worth is never up for negotiation. The air in the living room was so thick and heavy that it felt like I was breathing through a wet wool blanket, the kind we used to carry in the back of the transport trucks during late-night maneuvers. The silence that followed my mother dropping the pen was absolute, broken only by the steady, mocking tick of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room. I could see the dust motes dancing in the dim light, settling on the lace tablecloth that had been in our family for generations, now stained by the presence of people who never deserved to sit at it. I reached into my bag and pulled out a plain white envelope from the private lab in the city. I did not slide it across the table like a character in a movie. I dropped it heavily onto the center of the linens, right next to the cold remains of the pot roast. I looked at Elliot and told him the truth that was going to end the charade once and for all. I told him that Tommy is not his son. The DNA results were right there in that envelope, clear and indisputable. Then I turned my gaze to the woman who had been calling herself my sister-in-law for 2 years. She was not Meadow. Her real name was Margaret Winters, a woman with a long record of identity theft and a string of elderly victims left in her wake across 3 different states. I watched her face transform in the low light, the sweet, practiced mask she had been wearing finally rotting away to reveal the cold, calculated fear of a cornered animal. But the sound that broke the silence did not come from her. It came from my brother, and it was a sound I will never be able to unhear. Elliot did not reach for the papers. He did not even look surprised. He just leaned back in his chair and took another slow, deliberate sip of his wine, his eyes cold and empty as he stared at the wall where our father's portrait used to be. He admitted right then, with a casual indifference that turned my blood to ice, that he had known for a long time that the boy was not his. He told me he did not care about the bloodline. He told me he had made a deal with Margaret because she had promised to take care of the logistics that he found so exhausting. She was the one who was supposed to handle our mother, so he would not have to deal with the constant phone calls about doctor appointments, the repetitive questions about the bills, or the slow, demanding burden of someone else's aging process. I stood there, looking at the man I had shared a childhood with, the person who was supposed to be my first protector, and I realized he had become a stranger I would not even recognize on the street. He was a man filled with a quiet, simmering hatred, someone who was willing to raise another man's child and harbor a criminal just to ensure his own mother would never have a voice in this house again. He wanted her hidden away in that basement because it was easier for him to live a lie than to fulfill the most basic duty of a son. Then the resentment he had been feeding in the dark for years finally boiled over. He stood up and started shouting, his voice shaking with a bitterness that seemed to poison the very air of our childhood home. He told me he hated the way our mother had always spent every ounce of her energy on me and on the heavy, suffocating memory of our father. He said he was tired of living in the shadow of a man who had been gone for a decade, and he was done pretending that this red brick house was some kind of sacred shrine. Every word he threw at us felt like a jagged piece of glass, a deliberate attempt to sever the last threads of our family and leave us with nothing. I stood my ground, my feet planted firmly on the floorboards, listening to the man who shared my blood spit on our father's name and our mother's decades of sacrifice. I felt a deep, hollow shattering inside my soul that I know will never truly heal. It was no longer about the money Meadow had stolen or the mortgage papers on the table. It was about the realization that the person we had trusted to protect the family was the one who had been leading the charge to dismantle it from within, all because he considered his own mother's presence an inconvenience to his comfort. I finally turned my eyes away from the wreckage of my brother's conscience to look at my mother. She had not moved an inch since the shouting started. She was sitting perfectly still, her back as straight and unyielding as it had been on the day of my father's funeral. Her face was as white as the linens on the table, a stark contrast to the deep navy of her dress, but her eyes were dry. She was clutching her small, lace-edged handkerchief in her lap, her knuckles white from the strain of holding on to the only thing she had left in that moment. This was the peak of a betrayal that no mother should ever have to witness, the moment of absolute humiliation where the world stops making sense. To hear your own firstborn son admit in front of a room full of people that he considered your existence a problem to be handled, a burden to be cleared away like old, unwanted furniture, is a kind of pain that has no name. She was not crying because the wound was too deep for tears to reach. She was simply absorbing the fact that the child she had protected, fed, and raised with every bit of her love had grown up to become her most dangerous enemy. She looked at him not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating realization that the son she knew was gone, replaced by a man who valued his own convenience over her very life. I walked over to the wooden coat rack by the entrance where I had hung my MP uniform jacket when I arrived. I took it down, the heavy fabric and the cold metal of the insignia feeling like a shield in my hands. I walked back to the table and gently draped the olive drab jacket over my mother's shoulders. The fabric was large for her, swallowing her small frame, but I saw her lean into the weight of it as if it were the only thing holding her upright. I leaned down close to her ear and told her to stand up. I did not call her Mom. I called her Major Loretta, a title she had earned through her own years of service and a lifetime of quiet, unacknowledged bravery. I told her that she did not belong in the basement, and she certainly did not belong in the shadows of a son's resentment. I told her she belonged in the light, in the places where honor and dignity were still protected. In that moment, I was no longer just her daughter or Elliot's younger sister. I was an officer of the law, a protector of the people who had been pushed into the dark, and I was making it clear that the era of her silence was officially over. I could feel her hand reach up and grip the sleeve of my uniform, her fingers trembling but her hold steady and firm. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the room as my mother stood up, her hand resting on the arm of my uniform as we faced the people who had tried to erase her. Elliot and Margaret just stared at us, the reality of what they had done finally settling into the floorboards like a permanent stain. There were no apologies offered, no sudden bursts of regret, and I knew in my heart that none were coming. Some people are so deep in their own lies that the truth feels like an assault. Most of us spend our lives hoping for a moment of remorse from the people who hurt us, a sign that they realize the weight of the choices they made in the dark. But the women who have lived through 65 years of this world know that some betrayals are too deep for words and too old for a simple fix. There is no going back to the way things were before this Sunday dinner, and there is no way to unhear the things that were said in the heat of that shouting. There is only the long, hard path of moving forward with your head held high and your dignity intact. We did not need their permission to be whole again, and we did not need their validation to know who we were. We had the truth, and for the first time in this house, the truth was the only thing that mattered. After the storm of the truth had finally passed through the living room, a strange and heavy silence settled over the house. It was not the suffocating silence of secrets we had lived with for the past week, but a hollow, ringing quiet that happens when the walls have heard too much. I led my mother into the small den, the room where the air always seemed to hold the faint, lingering scent of my father's old pipe tobacco and cedar wood. The shadows here felt different, almost as if the memories of the man who built this home were stepping out of the corners to stand guard. We sat down at the small mahogany side table where the family Bible had rested for 40 years. I noticed the leather cover was worn smooth at the corners, polished by the friction of my father's hands during those long evenings of study. I opened the heavy cover carefully, and my mother's trembling fingers began to trace the sturdy, confident lines of his handwriting on the registry page. She turned the pages with a slow, reverent rhythm until she reached the middle of the book. Tucked inside the Book of Psalms was a small pressed flower, its petals turned to the color of old parchment, and a short note my father had scribbled in his precise military hand. He had a way of writing that was both disciplined and kind, a reflection of the life he lived. He had underlined a specific passage in the 23rd Psalm, the words about walking through the valley of the shadow of death and fearing no evil. Beside it, he had written a single sentence about staying steady when the ground beneath you starts to shake. It felt as if he had written those words specifically for her to find on this exact night, a message sent across a decade to remind her that she was never truly walking alone. I looked at those weathered pages and realized that Margaret might have been able to tear the pictures off the walls, and Elliot might have been able to sell the furniture, but they could never touch the things my father had woven into my mother's soul. The true strength of a military widow does not come from a loud voice or a display of force. It comes from a quiet, internal peace that settles into the bones when you realize you are finally standing on the side of the truth. I watched my mother take a long, deep breath, her shoulders dropping away from her ears for the first time since I pulled into the driveway. She was not just surviving the day anymore. She was remembering the woman she was meant to be. The legacy my father left behind was not in the red bricks of the house or the money in the bank, but in the unwavering dignity he had instilled in us. We went back to the plastic bins I had rescued from the garage and began to spread the old photos of my father out on the table. My mother reached out and rested her hand on a picture of him in his dress blues, her fingers lingering on the faded ink of his smile. She began to cry, but these were not the broken, ragged tears of a victim. They were tears of liberation, the kind that wash away the grit and the shame of being ignored. The weight of the lies had been lifted, replaced by a clear, hard resolve that I recognized from my own training. She looked up at me, and I saw the major's wife again, the woman who had managed an entire household and kept our world turning while her husband served his country halfway across the globe. We were not going to run away from the mess Elliot had made, and we were not going to hide in the basement anymore. We were going to stay right here and protect this home and everything it stood for, with the same quiet honor my father had shown every single day of his life. The quiet that followed our time with my father's Bible was different than the heavy, suffocating silence of the days before. It was a calm, expectant stillness, the kind you feel in the early morning hours on a base before the bugle calls everyone to attention. That peace was interrupted not by a sharp, demanding pounding, but by a steady and respectful knock at the front door. When I opened it, I didn't see another process server or a representative of some boutique debt collection agency. I saw a man who looked like he had been carrying a heavy secret of his own for a very long time. David Chen stood there with a worn manila folder in his hands, but he didn't look at me first. His eyes went straight to Tommy, who was sitting on the floor in the hallway with a stray puzzle piece. David didn't burst in with a loud voice or a list of demands. He simply walked into the entryway and knelt down so he was at eye level with the boy. He didn't ask for permission. He just looked at Tommy with a raw, aching kind of love that made my throat tighten. He spoke in a low, steady voice, apologizing for being away for so long and explaining that he had finally found the truth that had been hidden from him for 8 years. I watched a real father take his place in that moment, and it was a definition of family that had nothing to do with the lies Elliot and Margaret had been spinning. The sound of David's voice brought Elliot out of the kitchen, his face flushed, and his eyes darting around the room with a wild, desperate energy. He started shouting, his voice high and brittle as he demanded that David leave his private property immediately. He tried to claim that David had no right to be in this house, and that he was trespassing on family land. I stepped between them, my hand resting calmly on the folder David had brought. I pulled out a separate set of papers that had arrived by courier just an hour before from a local law firm. I looked my brother in the eye and told him that his claim to this house was currently under a legal freeze. I had filed a formal suit for mortgage fraud and the illegal transfer of military benefits. The house he was standing in was no longer a kingdom he could rule with his threats. Elliot's face went from a dark, angry red to a sickly, pale gray in a matter of seconds. He realized that the very ground he was standing on had turned into quicksand. The legal foundation he had built on a mountain of deceit was crumbling, and for the first time in his life, he had nowhere left to hide. He looked at Margaret, who was standing in the shadows of the dining room, but she didn't move to help him. She was already looking for her own exit. My mother stood at the edge of the kitchen, her hands resting on the back of a chair as she watched this scene unfold. She looked at David and Tommy, then shifted her gaze to the brother who had betrayed her. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the slow and painful realization that family is not always defined by the names on a birth certificate. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones who are most willing to see you disappear into the dark, and the people you have never met are the ones who will stand in the gap to protect you. Most women who have lived through 65 years of family drama know that the truth can be a terrifying thing, but it is also the only medicine that can truly cure a house full of rot. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a woman who was finally seeing the world for what it really was, and even though the truth was painful, it was bringing her a sense of clarity that she hadn't felt in a decade. We decided to stay in the kitchen together, ignoring the hushed, angry whispers coming from the front of the house. We started preparing a pot roast, the same meal my father used to request every time he came home from a long deployment. The physical act of searing the beef in the heavy cast-iron skillet, the sound of the onions and garlic sizzling in the oil, and the smell of fresh rosemary and potatoes felt like a sacred ritual of reclamation. As the rich, savory aroma began to fill the kitchen, it started to push out the damp, cold smell of the basement and the lingering scent of Margaret's expensive perfume. The kitchen was alive again with the sound of running water, the rhythmic chopping of carrots on the wooden board, and the quiet laughter of a child who was finally feeling safe. We were building a new kind of family right there over a simmering pot, a community of people who were brought together not by convenience or greed, but by a shared commitment to the truth. David sat at the table with my mother, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee as he watched Tommy help her put the lid on the roasting pan. He looked at her with a level of respect that made her shoulders straighten and her eyes clear. He leaned in and made a promise that I knew he would keep for the rest of his life. He told her that regardless of what the lawyers or the courts said, she was Tommy's grandmother, and that would never change. He told her that she was the only person in this house who had truly loved that boy without an agenda, and he wasn't going to let that bond be broken by a lie. I saw my mother smile, a real, genuine smile of relief that softened the tired lines around her eyes. She finally understood that the love she had poured into her grandson hadn't been a waste. It was the one thing that Margaret and Elliot could never steal from her, and it was the bridge that was going to lead us all into a better future. Have you ever realized the people closest to you were the ones working against you, while a near stranger was the one who actually showed up? If someone unexpected stood by you when your own family wouldn't, tell me about them in the comments. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. We're almost at the end of this fight. The old power of attorney forms, those gray and lifeless sheets of paper that Margaret had used to strip my mother of her dignity, were finally gone. I watched them tear into jagged scraps on the kitchen table. The sound of the paper ripping felt like a heavy chain finally snapping after years of tension. In their place sat a new stack of documents, crisp and white, carrying the true weight of our history and the promise of a life reclaimed. We were no longer talking about family peace or the quiet suggestions of a son who claimed to know best. We were talking about the law, and the law was finally standing on our side of the table. Margaret sat across from us, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were the color of bone, while Elliot stood by the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he stared out at the red brick walls he no longer controlled. They were cornered now, and like anyone who realizes their lies have run out of room to breathe, they reached for the only tool they had left in their arsenal: fear. Elliot turned around, his face a sickly shade of gray, and told me that my mother was clearly suffering from a severe cognitive breakdown. He claimed that her recent behavior, especially allowing a stranger like David Chen into the house, was all the proof he needed to show she was a danger to herself. He looked me right in the eye and threatened to have her committed to a high-security mental health facility before the week was over, if we did not sign the house back into his name immediately. He called it a necessary step for her own safety, trying to wrap a prison sentence in the language of care. It was the ultimate betrayal, the kind of threat that makes the air in a room feel thin and impossible to breathe. He was trying to use the very systems my father had spent his life defending to lock his own mother away in a room with a bolted door, all to protect a mortgage he had stolen. I did not flinch, and I did not raise my voice. My training as an MP has taught me that the truth does not need to shout to be heard. I reached into my bag and pulled out the independent psychiatric evaluation we had completed at the VA only 2 days prior. I laid the document directly on top of the retirement asset statements, the blue seal of the department looking like a shield against their cruelty. I told them that Dr. Thompson and a full board of military specialists had found my mother completely sound of mind, with a cognitive clarity that most people half her age would envy. I looked at my brother and told him in a voice that was as cold and steady as a North Carolina winter that he could not use the law to imprison a free soul. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that happens when a bully realizes their power has been completely neutralized. Margaret stared at the VA seal, her sugary smile long gone, realizing that her game of treating my mother like a confused child was officially over. My mother reached for the silver pen I had placed on the table, her hand steady and firm. It was a far cry from the trembling, uncertain woman I had found sitting on a folding chair in the basement just a week ago. She began to sign the revocation of Meadows' access to her accounts, her signature flowing across the lines with the quiet authority she used to have when she was running the logistics for an entire unit. She was not signing for the money that had been drained from the retirement account, and she was not signing because she wanted to hurt anyone. She was signing to reclaim every single hour of hard work, every double shift she had worked, and every cent she had carefully saved while clipping coupons in the middle of the night. She was making it clear that her life's work was not a doormat for someone else to wipe their muddy feet on. I watched her go through the retirement asset statements line by line, officially removing the people who had treated her like a personal bank. Elliot stood there, his mouth slightly open, finally realizing that his calculated betrayal had led him directly into a dead end. He had spent years underestimating the woman who raised him, thinking her silence was a sign of weakness, when it was actually just the sign of a patient woman waiting for the right moment to speak. Looking at my mother in that moment, I felt a sense of liberation that I cannot quite put into words. Most women over 65 are terrified of the legal system, of the coldness of lawyers, and the complexity of the paperwork. They often choose to stay quiet and accept the mistreatment because they do not want to be seen as difficult or ungrateful to the children they raised. But when they finally realize that the truth is the only thing that can protect the legacy they spent a lifetime building, they become stronger than anyone I have ever met on a base. My mother was no longer a victim waiting for someone to come and save her. She was the one doing the saving. She was taking back control of her home, her finances, and her future, for the first time after 2 long years of being a prisoner in her own life. The shadows that had been lingering in the corners of this red brick house were finally being pushed back by the light of her own resolve. She looked up at me when the last page was signed, and for the first time since I arrived, I did not see the fear. I saw the major's wife, a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth, and she was finally ready to step out of the shadows for good. The blue and red lights did not arrive with the screaming sirens I was used to hearing during my shifts at the base. They came quietly, their rhythmic pulses washing over the red brick walls of the house like a slow, neon tide. I stood on the sidewalk, my feet planted firmly on the ground I had played on as a child, watching as the local police cruisers and the unmarked black sedan from the CID pulled into the driveway. For so long, this house had been a place of shadows and whispered threats, a place where the truth was tucked away in a damp basement like an old, unwanted rug. But as those lights began to swirl against the oak trees, I knew the cleanup had finally begun. I had spent the last 48 hours on the phone, coordinating with my contacts in the military justice system and the local sheriff's office, laying out the trail of forged signatures and stolen identities that Margaret Winters had used to weave her web. It was not an act of anger. It was an act of restoration. The truth didn't need to shout tonight. It just needed to show up in a uniform. I led the officers through the front door, the same door my mother had kept polished for decades. Margaret was in the living room, surrounded by her expensive shopping bags, her face pale as she realized the black car in the driveway wasn't a delivery service. I watched the officer step forward and recite the name Margaret Winters, a name she hadn't used in 8 years. When the cold steel of the handcuffs finally clicked around her wrists, the sound echoed through the hallway like the final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. Margaret didn't try to charm her way out of it this time. She didn't offer a sugary smile or a fake excuse about my mother's health. She just looked at the floor, her shoulders slumped, as the entire life she had built on the bones of my family's legacy collapsed in a single night. Elliot stood by the fireplace, his mouth hanging open, his hands trembling as he watched his world fall apart. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the person he chose to harbor was the very one who was going to drag him down into the dark. The neighborhood was quiet, but I could see the curtains twitching in the houses across the street. Mrs. Gable was standing on her porch, her arms crossed over her sweater, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in our driveway. The community that Margaret and Elliot had tried to manipulate with their lies about my mother's mind was now seeing the reality for themselves. Elliot tried to step forward, his voice a ragged whisper as he asked what was going to happen to the boy, but he couldn't even meet my gaze. I told him that Tommy was with David Chen now, in a place where the truth was not a burden to be managed. I watched my brother realize that he was no longer the man in charge of this house or its secrets. He was just a man who had betrayed his own mother for a promise of convenience, and now he was being left with nothing but the silence of his own choices. The sheriff told him he had until morning to pack a single bag and vacate the property, as his legal standing to manage the estate had been officially revoked by the court. He looked at the red bricks, the walls he had tried to sell off piece by piece, and I saw the crushing weight of shame finally settle into his eyes. I walked back into the house and found my mother standing at the top of the stairs. She was still wearing her navy dress, her hands resting lightly on the banister. She didn't look like a victim, and she didn't look like she was celebrating. She just looked peaceful. I walked up and stood beside her, and together we watched as they led Margaret out the door for the last time. The house felt lighter, as if the very air were finally beginning to circulate after years of being held still. Most women over 65 know that justice in this world is rarely loud or spectacular. It doesn't always look like a movie. Sometimes justice is just the quiet moment when the person who tried to make you invisible is finally the one who has to leave the room. It is the moment when you realize you don't have to apologize for taking up space in the home you paid for, with your own hard work and sacrifice. We stood there together in the hallway, two women who had been pushed into the shadows, now standing in the full, honest light of the truth. We walked out onto the porch as the last police car pulled away, the silence of the North Carolina night settling back into the trees. The overhead porch light was burning bright, casting a warm yellow glow over my mother's face. She looked at the driveway, then at the garden she was going to replant in the spring, and I saw her take a long, deep breath. The dignity that had been stripped away from her in that basement was back where it belonged. It was standing at the head of the table, and it was reflected in the way she held her chin high. For those 65 and older, there is no greater satisfaction than seeing the truth finally take its place in the center of the family. It is a quiet, deep-seated relief that settles into your soul when you realize that the legacy you spent a lifetime building is no longer under threat. The people who tried to treat my mother like an inconvenience were gone, and the house was finally hers again. The next morning, the sun rose over the suburbs with a brilliance that seemed to wash everything clean. I walked down to the end of the driveway, carrying a small package of vinyl letters I had picked up at the hardware store. The old mailbox was covered in a layer of grime and a messy handwritten label that Elliot had slapped on it a year ago. I took a damp cloth and carefully wiped away the dust, peeling off the old tape until the surface was smooth and clear. Then I began to apply the new letters, one by one. LORETTAOLIVER. It wasn't just a label, it was a declaration. It was a statement to the neighbors, to the mail carrier, and to the world that the owner of this house had returned. It was a small physical act of reclamation that felt more important than any of the legal documents we had signed the day before. I looked up and saw my mother watching me from the front door, a cup of Maxwell House coffee in her hand, her eyes bright with a sense of ownership that no one would ever be able to take from her again. She was no longer a guest in her own life. She was the woman whose name was on the box. Months have passed since the shadows were pushed back, and the jagged wounds that once threatened to tear this home apart are finally healing under the steady care of honesty and real love. I sit here at the kitchen table, watching my mother move with a quiet purpose as she serves a steaming pot roast to David and Tommy. The room is bright, filled with the savory scent of rosemary that now represents safety instead of a struggle. My mother sits exactly where she belongs, right at the head of the table, in the heavy oak chair that no one will ever be able to push her from again. Her name is back on the mailbox, and every morning the birds singing in the rose garden she has lovingly restored make the entire house feel alive. We are no longer living in the shadows of silence. We are living in the warm light of a dignity that is finally protected. I have learned that we should never let the desire for a false peace become a cage for our own worth. Silence might avoid a conflict, but only the truth can provide a foundation for a happy home. To the women listening, please remember that you are never invisible. Your sacrifice is a virtue, but protecting your own dignity is a responsibility you owe to the legacy you spent a lifetime building. You have earned your place through every meal served and every challenge faced. Do not ever let anyone move your chair from the head of the table.